Classic Treasury. Magical Stories. The Enchanted Horse, from the Arabian Nights Entertainment, adapted by Amy STEEDMAN. It was New Year's Day in Persia, and the king had been entertained by many wonderful shows prepared by his people. Evening was drawing on when an Indian appeared, leading a horse he wished to show to the king. It was not real, but it was so wonderfully made that it looked alive. "Your Majesty," cried the Indian, bowing low, "I beg you to look at this wonder. Nothing you've seen can equal my horse. I have only to sit on its back and wish myself in any part of the world, and it carries me there in a few minutes." "Show us what it can do," said the king, commanded. He pointed to a distant mountain and bade the Indian to fetch a branch from the palm trees there. The Indian vaulted into the saddle, turned a little peg in the horse's neck, and in a moment was flying so swiftly through the air that he soon disappeared from sight. In less than a quarter of an hour, he reappeared and laid a branch from the palm tree at the king's feet. "Yes," cried the king, "your enchanted horse is the most wonderful thing I have seen. What is the price? I must have it." "Your Majesty," the Indian replied, "it shall be yours if you will let me marry your daughter." At these words the king's son sprang to his feet. "Sire," he cried, "you would never dream of granting such a request." "Son," said the king, "at whatever cost, I must have this wonderful horse. But before I agree, try the horse and tell me what you think of it." The Indian began to tell the prince how to work the horse. But as soon as the prince was in the saddle, he turned the screw and went flying off in the air. "Alas!" cried the Indian, "he has gone before learning how to return." "Wretch!" the king cried, "you shall be cast into prison, and unless my son returns in safety, you will be put to death." Meanwhile, the prince had gone gaily sailing up into the clouds and could no longer see the earth below. This was very pleasant, and he felt that he had never such a delicious ride in his life before. But presently he began to think how it was time to descend. He screwed the peg around and round, backwards and forwards, but it seemed to make no difference. Instead of coming down, he sailed higher until he thought he was going to knock his head against the blue sky. What was to be done? The prince began to grow a little nervous, and he felt over the horse's neck to see if there was another peg to be found anywhere. To his joy, just behind the ear, he touched a small screw, and when he turned it, he felt he was going slower and slower, and gently turning round. Then the enchanted horse flew downwards through the starry night, and the prince saw stretched out before him a beautiful city gleaming white through the purple night. He let the horse go where it would, and presently it stopped on the roof of a great marble palace. He descended some great marble steps and found himself in a great hall where a row of slaves were sleeping soundly, guarding the entrance to a room beyond. Very softly, the prince crept past the guards and, lifting the curtain from the door, looked in. And there he saw a splendid room lighted by 1,000 lights and filled with sleeping slaves. In the middle, upon a sofa, was the most beautiful princess his eyes had ever gazed upon. He went softly to her side, and kneeling by the sofa, gently touched her hand. The princess sighed and opened her eyes, but before she could cry out, he begged her in a whisper to be silent and fear nothing. "I am the son of the king of Persia." Now this princess was no other than the daughter of the king of Bengal. Never before had the princess seen anyone so gallant and handsome as this strange young prince. She gave him her hand, awoke her slaves, and bade them give him refreshment. While the prince rested, she dressed herself in her loveliest robes and twined her hair with her most precious jewels, that she might appear as beautiful as possible. And when the prince saw her again, he thought her the most charming princess in the world, and he loved her with all his heart. When he had told her all his adventures, she sighed to think that he must now leave her and return to his father's court. "My princess," he said, "since it is so hard to part, will you not ride with me upon the enchanted horse? Then when we arrive once more in Persia, we will marry." So together they mounted the enchanted horse. The prince placed his arms around the princess and turned the magic peg. Up and up they flew, over land and sea, and then the prince turned the other screw, and they landed just outside his father's city. He left the princess at a palace outside the gates, for he wished to go alone to prepare his father. "My son!" cried the king, joyful at his return. And the prince told the king all about his adventure and the princess of Bengal. "Let her be brought here," cried the king, "and the marriage shall take place today." Then he ordered the Indian should be set free and allowed to depart with the enchanted horse. Great was the surprise of the Indian when he was released instead of having his head cut off, as he had expected. But when he heard about the prince's adventure, a wicked plan came into his head. He flew on the enchanted horse to the palace where the princess was waiting, arriving before the king's messengers could reach her. "Tell the princess," he said to the palace slaves, "that the prince of Persia has sent me to bring her to his father's place upon the enchanted horse." The princess was very glad when she heard this message. But alas! As soon as the Indian turned the peg and the horse flew away, she found she was being carried off far away from Persia and her beloved prince. All her prayers and entreaties were in vain. The Indian only mocked her and said he meant to marry her himself. When the prince discovered what had happened, he was beside himself with grief. He set off to look for her, vowing that he would find her or perish in the attempt. By this time, the enchanted horse had traveled many hundreds of miles. The Indian descended into a wood close to the town of Kashmir, where he went in search for food. As soon as the princess had eaten a little, she felt stronger and braver, and as she heard horses galloping past, she called out loudly for help. The men on the horseback came riding at once to her aid. The leader of the horsemen, who was the Sultan of Kashmir, cut off the Indian's head, placed the princess upon his horse, and led her to his palace. He had made up his mind to marry her himself. In vain the princess begged and pleaded to be sent back to Persia, but the Sultan only smiled and began the wedding preparations. Then she thought of a plan to save herself. She began talking all the nonsense she could think of and behaving as if she was mad. So well did she pretend that the wedding was put off, and all the doctors were called to see if they could cure her. Of course, none of them could. All this time, the Prince of Persia was searching for his princess, and when he came to one of the great cities of India, he quickly learned that everyone was talking about the sad illness of the Princess of Bengal, who was to marry the Sultan. He at once disguised himself as a doctor and went to the palace. The Sultan received him with joy and led him at once to where the princess sat alone, weeping and wringing her hands. "Your Majesty," said the disguised prince, "no one must enter the room with me, or the cure will surely fail, and the princess will never recover." So the Sultan left him, and the prince went to the princess and touched her hand. "My beloved princess," he said, "do you know me?" As soon as the princess heard that dear voice, she threw herself into the prince's arms. "We must at once plan our escape," said the prince. "Can you tell me what has become of the enchanted horse?" "Nothing can I tell you of it, dear prince," said the princess. "But since the Sultan knows its value, no doubt he has kept it in some safe place." "Then first we must persuade the Sultan that you are almost cured," said the prince. "Put on your most expensive robes and dine with him tonight, and I will do the rest." The Sultan was charmed to find the princess so much recovered, and his joy knew no bounds. When the new doctor informed him that he had hoped by the next day to have the cure complete. "I find that the princess has somehow been infected by the magic of the enchanted horse," he said. "If you will have the horse brought out in the great square and place the princess upon its back, I will prepare some magic perfumes that will dispel the enchantment." So the next morning, the enchanted horse was brought into the square, which was crowded with onlookers, and the princess was mounted upon its back. Then the disguised prince placed 4 braziers of burning coals round the horse and threw into them a delicious perfume. The smoke of the perfume rose in thick clouds, almost hiding the princess. And at that moment, the prince leaped into the saddle behind her and turned the peg and sailed away into the blue sky. The enchanted horse did not stop until it had carried the two of them safely back to Persia. And there they were married amid great rejoicings. But what became of the enchanted horse? Ah, that is the question that no one can answer. The end.